ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear now what are the legal procedures that are taking place, what actions being taken, what we can do, an update. I think that's one of the most exciting parts of the whole movement, and a lot of people say, at long last, something happens. Very good work was done by the engineers, but now the lawyers can take and use all the evidence that was collected. So we built on each other's knowledge and strength, and we need to keep on working together. And I think people in my environment, when they learned that we take on the FBI and bring them to court, some people say, wow, now it's getting real. Barbara, inform us about the situation.
All right, so we're starting the next section. It's a relatively short section, maybe a little bit over half an hour, on the breakthroughs for 9/11 Truth and Justice by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And I'm happy to announce that our founding president, Attorney Jane Clark, is waiting on Skype. I'm going to do a relatively short overview, then I'll introduce Jane, and hopefully you'll see her on the screen as I start my introduction in a little bit. So, part two of our event today is on breakthroughs for 9/11 Truth and Justice. To frame the context for why going into the judicial system, especially in the United States where the attacks of 9/11 happened, why it's so important. And that's because today, especially after 9/11, so much is compromised by money and threats and fear in all areas of life, in all professions. We expect our academicians to tell the truth. There are precious few of them who have the courage to do that. And when they do, they've been fired, even those with tenure, or removed from their positions with basically a promise that they would be fired if they didn't voluntarily resign. We could list all of those academicians, but that's for later. We expect facts and truth to matter to journalism, but journalists are compromised, and there are precious few journalists who tell the truth. That is my profession, by the way. I go on the record, I am not an attorney. I did supervise attorneys at the Department of Justice, and so now I'm working with attorneys. I'm on the research side, the content side for our documents, but I am not an attorney, so I want you to know that. But I was a high-level Department of Justice official. So to frame the context here, especially since 9/11, I believe that the central battle of modern Western civilization is between truth and power, or facts and power. And I don't know if you remember this. US journalist, a very fine journalist, an honest journalist, Ron Suskind, met with Karl Rove, who was a senior advisor to President George W. Bush. And this is what Rove told him, and it was published in the New York Times Magazine in October of 2004. Many of you will recognize this quote, but I want to set it as the context for this part of our program. Quote, Rove said, he said that guys like me, journalists, fact-oriented people like us, he said that guys like me were, quote, in what we, meaning Rove, Bush, etc., in what we call the reality-based community, which I'm sure he said with a snicker, which he defined as people who, quote, believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded, this is Suskind now, I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism and, you know, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all that. He cut me off, quote, but that's not the way the world works anymore, he said. We're, after 9/11, we're, the United States, an empire now. And when we act, we create reality. And while you, the so-called fact-based community, like those of us in this room, or you wouldn't be here, and while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll just act again, creating our and your realities, which you will then study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, And you, all of you, will be left just to study what we do. Now that's the attitude. That's the attitude of the people who killed almost 3,000 people on 9/11. So, to set the stage for the judicial aspect of trying to bring power and truth together, which is what he's saying here is truth doesn't matter, folks. You know, if it doesn't connect with the physical world and change anything, it doesn't matter. It will just weaken you and destroy your spirit. And we know that. So we're in a spiritual battle, as well as a battle in the physical world. So in my belief, the central battle of Western modern civilization is between truth and power. And I want to remind you of this famous quote by Gandhi, who started his Satyagraha movement, which, after all, got rid of an empire out of his entire country in a very short period of time, really. He founded his Satyagraha movement, which means truth, power, or bringing power to the truth together, on September 11th, in the early 1900s. Within only a few years, a true evil empire was driven out of India. To win, the 9/11 truth movement has to unite truth and power, like Gandhi did. And we do that, I believe, first and foremost. That's why I'm on the board of the Lawyers Committee. That's why I spend almost all of my time on board calls with the Lawyers Committee, by officializing the facts. So what do I mean by that? If you have facts, if you have on the one hand the government, which is lying but they have authority, and on the other end credibility, in other words, most of the populace still thinks, well, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, which is a big mistake. And on the other hand, you have the facts or the truth, like everything you're seeing here. Look at Richard Gage's presentation or my presentation about the Pentagon. We have the facts. They're absolutely indisputable facts, but they're just facts. We have to officialize them. We bring truth and the power of the state together by officializing the facts, and you do that through the legal system. So that's why the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry was created. And this is our website. It's very important, no matter what you hear today, that you go to the website and study the documents there. And the website is LC, stands for Lawyers Committee for 911.org. Please go there. To get to the actual documents, there's a horizontal menu across the top, and you click on those individual items, and little pull-down menus come. Then you click on those to get to the documents that we've actually filed with a court, or that we've filed in FOIA lawsuits or FOIA requests, that kind of thing. You can read the actual documents. Okay. This next slide is very important to me. I would like to personally dedicate this part of our event today to the memory of Judge Ferdinando Empozomato. And I might cry when I tell you about this man. Judge Ferdinando Empozomato was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Italy. In their system, they are magistrate judges. They do both the investigation and they're the judge. So they have tremendous power relative to our judges. And he was the most important person in their legal system to uncovering in their legal system the facts about the Gladio false flag attacks against massive numbers of innocent civilians throughout Europe, especially in his country of Italy, known as Operation Gladio. And so this is the man who actually did the work that showed that the explosives, and he's written books about this, unfortunately they're still in Italian, we're trying to get them translated into English, but he was able to show that the explosives that were used in the Bologna massacre, if I recall, Danielle Genser can correct me if I'm wrong about that particular terrorist attack, but I believe that it was the Bologna train station massacre where Judge Empozomato proved that the explosives came from the NATO base there in Italy, okay? So this is the man who, he also was the chief magistrative judge who went after the mafia, and also against Gladio. So, thank you, Judge Impasamato. Again, no one can introduce the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry better than our Vice President. He has also been our Executive Director, the wonderful truth and justice activist of many decades, Ed Asner. And so now we're going to hear just a little bit from Ed, and then I will introduce our founding president, Jane Clark.
Hello, I'm Ed Asner. I have important news of a promising development in the area of law and justice, and I need your help. Let's face it, nearly 15 years have gone by, and the essential truth of 9/11 remains untold. The call for justice remains unanswered. This is why I'm here, to introduce the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, a nonprofit organization which has been formed to address this exact problem. After years of analysis, strategizing, and planning, the Lawyers Committee is ready to implement a carefully planned strategy to achieve the goals of transparency and accountability for the crime of 9/11. To achieve these important goals, the Lawyers Committee has committed itself to performing a thorough and independent investigation, preparing and filing a petition for a federal grand jury, and pursuing civil lawsuits, including lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Act.
The Freedom of Information Act is perhaps the most powerful instrument we have for making our government honest and transparent.
Why is this so important now? Because this may be one of our last opportunities to expose the falsehoods of the official 9/11 narrative that has cost us so much in money, lives, international respect and prestige, and our constitutional rights. Just as important, this is our best chance to investigate and expose the private and illegal agenda behind the ongoing global war on terror, which began as a result of 9/11. The encouraging news is, with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, we now have a team of experienced lawyers dedicated to pick up where previous investigations left off and do the work that I expect will have truly historic consequences. I'm pleased to announce that I proudly agreed to serve on this board of directors.
As a lead-in to introducing our remote guest for this section of the program, I'm just going to briefly show you the people. We're just people, but we've come together to try to be the David who takes on Goliath. So the Lawyers Committee Board of Directors, we're only 6 human beings. And you're about to meet our founding president and board member, Jane Clark, Attorney Jane Clark. And there's Jane. And by the way, Jane and I went to Rome and met personally with Judge Impasamato, so he's a very important person to us in our personal lives as well. Our current president, who's now taken over that role, as well as executive director, and Ed Asner used to be our executive director, he's now our vice president, kind of, rotating jobs, is David Meiswinkle, Attorney David Meiswinkle. And again, Ed Asner, there he is our vice president currently. We were going to have our litigation director by Skype today, but unfortunately he's caught in a storm, trying to travel from the Midwest to California, where he's supposed to give a 9/11 address tonight. So he was not able to be with us, but that's okay, because Jane and I are on the board and we can tell you what's happened. And then there's myself, I'm on the board, and our 6th member of the board is Bill Jacoby, Attorney Bill Jacoby, who is also the national head of the 9/11 Truth Action Project in the United States. That's also known as TAP, Truth Action Project, 9/11 TAP, and they have a website, 911tap.org. www.911tap.org. And my co-host and co-convener, Jan van Aken, is also, I believe, with EuropeTap. Isn't that correct? With EuropeTap. So there's a EuropeTap too if you'd like to join. He's the guy to see, okay? All right. So what I'm going to do now is to introduce Jane. And because Mick was going to be a major part of this presentation, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jane, our founding president, current board member and officer, and see what she wants to tell you. And she'll go into probably a lot of detail that Mick would have gone into. So I have to wait and see what she covers. And anything that Jane just hasn't happened to cover, I have backup slides that I might come on afterwards. So now I'm going to introduce Jane. And if maybe we could see Jane? Ah, Jane. Can Jane hear us?
Hi, how you doing?
Hi, Jane.
Can you hear me? I say big howdy from Texas.
Jane's in Texas. She's in a suburb of Dallas called Arlington. So Jane Clark Esquire, my dear friend and colleague, is a board member and was the founding president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Her Texas private law practice of nearly 3 decades includes workers' compensation, probate, personal injury, collections, and domestic relations cases. She earned her law degree from the University of Idaho Law School in Moscow, a master's degree in biochemistry and biophysics from Texas A&M University College Station, and worked with renowned Professor Emeritus Dr. Joseph, I'm going to butcher this name, Nagyvaryof of Budapest, Hungary, on cancer research, fundamental cancer research. From 1980 to the present time, Attorney Jane Clark has worked with major JFK, John F. Kennedy, and RFK, Robert Kennedy, assassination researchers, including the late Lawrence Teeter, Attorney late Lawrence Teeter, in his position as counsel for the alleged Robert Kennedy assassin, Sirhan Sirhan. She has served as the attorney also for the JFK Lancer Conference, which is a major conference held in Dallas, Texas, on or around the anniversary of the JFK assassination each year, attended by JFK assassination researchers worldwide. So let's all welcome Jane Clark.
Thank you all. I haven't really done this format before, but I will work on it. We lawyers started this journey with 9/11 in February of 2014. Our first meeting was 2/26/14 and was a conference, a teleconference that was put together by a woman named Susan Watkins. She was a fancy legal secretary called a paralegal, and she had been a volunteer with Richard Gage's organization and had gotten a list of lawyers from his petition that he had out in the public as asking for a new 9/11 investigation. So that's how she contacted the lawyers and started the teleconference group. Susan emailed out or called herself all these individuals, and we had our first meeting on 2/26/14. Bill Jacoby and myself were on that first call, and we are now board directors. We started these calls weekly, and then they went to monthly, and we set up a set of goals. Now, the first set of goals was, okay, we're here, we understand we don't agree with the government story. What do we need to look at first? So what we did was we did some research, some legal research, and what we found out was, number one, the U.S. government had set up a fund called the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, and if the victims of the 9/11 families accepted that money, they could not sue. That was it. There were large amounts, but they still could not sue after that. That was administered by an attorney out of Massachusetts called Kenneth Feinberg, and he worked for 33 months without compensation. He was considered a national arbitrator. Next, what we found was those that didn't accept the government handout were about 100 families, and they were in lawsuits. in the Southern District of New York. They all settled their cases. They were all sealed, and we couldn't find out what happened, really. There was some discovery that was very little, actually. They were put into a forced arbitration with the courts, and the cases got settled. The only one that didn't get settled was the Ella Mariana case. In that case, she made the judge mad, and so I guess he didn't seal hers. I don't know. One of our lawyers that was on our initial calls was her attorney. Other lawsuits that were elsewhere were in New York, and they were essentially, we're trying to go, why are all these lawsuits in New York? Well, what we found out was, because we have planes that were hitting in DC, allegedly, we have incidents in Pennsylvania, and of course we have New York incidents. So we looked into an act that was enacted amazingly 11 days after 9/11, and it was called the Transportation Safety and Systems Stabilization Act. Now, for those that are taking notes, that may be taking notes, we call this 49 USC 40101. That's how you look it up in the federal code. And this was I'll call it the Transportation Stabilization Act, that makes it easier. This act was passed by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, written, passed by both houses of Congress, and given to the president to sign in 11 days. Now that's rather hard to do in Washington, D.C. But it was done, and it was mainly done for the purposes of stabilizing the air transportation industry, the aviation industry. But in that act, all cases related to 9/11, if you're going to sue, had to be done in the Southern District of New York. It didn't matter where your case was. If it was in California, if it was in Washington, D.C., it had to be transferred to New York. So we found that, again, those were all settled and sealed, and it was very hard to see that there was no discovery there. The discovery in a lawsuit brings you the facts. We didn't have much discovery. So we looked at other cases, and there was the cases that related to insurance companies and corporations. Those lawsuits, again, were settled. Of course, we're looking at in 2014, that's 13 years after the events. Those were settled and sealed also. Now, there was more discovery in those cases. However, we couldn't get to that either. We actually literally tried to go and talk to lawyers in a law firm in New Jersey or New York to get depositions, and they wouldn't release them. They said these are all sealed, anything having to do with these lawsuits. So we're like, great, no discovery there, even though we know it's there. Then we found out there was also lawsuits related to foreign entities. This would be the Saudi Arabia large lawsuit in New York, and Iran was in there. Iran didn't participate. They had a huge default judgment that they probably will never, no one will ever collect from that unless they can find some sort of assets from Iran in this country, and the government's not that dumb. So we have Saudi Arabia, and these cases are really, really large. If you have access, and the public, anybody from the public can have access to pacer.gov, you can look at these lawsuits. They have minimal charges for downloading documents and looking at documents, but that's www.pacer.gov. So if you prefer to look at them, you can. Anyway, the Saudi Arabian entities were in and out of the lawsuit. They were dismissed, they were put back in by the courts, and it's still pending to this day. Thankfully for the JASTA Act, Justice Against State-Sponsored Terrorism Act, the Saudi Arabia lost its sovereign immunity and therefore can be sued for terrorism acts if they can be proved by the plaintiffs. Now, in that lawsuit, it's over 800 plaintiffs, if not more by now. The place to look for that would be to go to one of the plaintiffs' law firms called the Motley Rice Law Firm, and that's at motleyrice.com. They will give you a complete overview of what's going on with the plaintiff's lawsuit. They are one of the sets of plaintiffs' lawyers in that lawsuit. They aren't the only one. There's many, many more. The case is very huge. It's been a backlog. The judges have so much going on there. They haven't made rulings on multiple motions, and who knows when that'll be finished. So after we did this legal review with the lawyers, we continued teleconferencing and wanted to create a set of goals. We looked at some news issues going on. There was the 28 pages that is the issue. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they were 28 pages that were redacted out of the 9/11 Commission report, and they were redacted by the Bush administration. The two congressmen were pushing to get that unredacted so the public could see what was going on. And I'd like to leave that to Barbara to discuss because she was intimately involved with Mick Harrison, our litigation director and also board member in that whole issue. We also looked at the lawsuit down in Florida with the newspapers, and the newspaper, the Florida Bulldog, was suing the FBI. The FBI would not release documents and said it's not a big deal. We didn't look at this issue too much with the Saudi family down in Florida. Well, we find out that there's 80,000 pages that they created for that specific issue. So the courts took years to look that over, and I don't know exactly what's been released on that, but those are the type of things that we're looking at initially. So we were up to about 30 lawyers then, meeting monthly, and as most non-paying organizations, maybe 10 to 15 would be on the calls. But we decided at that point to collect resumes for the lawyers to get to know who had what strengths for our group and to get to know each other as well. And about that time, again, Susan Watkins was continuing to organize the lawyers. Well, we had an incident that happened in April of 2014 that put a chilling effect on our group. Susan Watkins was found dead in her home. She had hung herself, from what we understand from the police, and this is something that a lot of the attorneys didn't accept. They thought there was more to it, but we don't really know. We have not been able to investigate what exactly happened. All we know is that she wrote things on the wall, supposedly. We don't know if that's been verified, but we do know that she was dead. Some of the lawyers dropped out after that. That bothered them. But we did continue on, and we're up to about 50 attorneys that we do keep involved in the group now. Shortly after her death, Mick Harrison joined our group, and he's now a board member and litigation director. Mick and I incorporated in 2015 the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry Incorporated, which is a nonprofit organization. And what we do, we are looking at as our mission in a nutshell is charitable, educational, and scientific purposes with goals to defend the civil and human rights of individuals and to promote the government accountability, especially focused on 9/11. Our primary goal is to help the public, law enforcement, and Congress understand the full and discover the full truth of 9/11. We would truly, and speaking of Judge Imposimato, we did work with him. We did have plans with him for the United Nations and their Human Rights Division. We would welcome any European lawyers in your groups to join us because there's projects that are undone after his death. Rest his soul. But thank you very much, and if you can help us in any way, we sure would appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm going to supplement your presentation for a little bit, and then I'll turn it back over to you for maybe comments on this part. Jane wanted me to tell you about our Lawyers Committee was truly instrumental in the person of myself and Mick Harrison, who unfortunately was going to be a speaker and is caught in a storm halfway across the country going to California. So he couldn't be here today, and he apologizes and wanted very much to be with you. But what Jane was referring to is for over 14 years as the election actually of 2016 approached. The 28 pages, which was the fully redacted or fully blacked out, fully censored chapter, a whole chapter, it's 28 pages long, that's why it's called the 28 pages, of the original 9/11 Commission report, which was published back in the summer of 2004, as I recall. And so that redacted chapter, it had leaked out here and there that it had to do with Saudi involvement, allegedly, with the alleged 15 muscle Saudi hijackers. The 9/11 victims' family members, including many of them that are now part of this huge Motley Rice lawsuit against Saudi Arabia for their alleged involvement in the plot of 9/11, and I get to that in a moment. The important word is plot, not execution of 9/11. In other words, the conspiracy or the plan for the execution of 9/11 without actually doing the execution of 9/11. Somebody else did that. So going back to, as we were leading up to September, the September 11th of 2016, we were during the end of the 2016 presidential campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And as that approached, many of the 9/11 victims' family members, headed by Terry Strada, who represents these family members in public. She lost her husband in World Trade Center on 9/11. That this group, subgroup of the 9/11 victims' family members who have an ongoing case against Saudi Arabia for their complicity in the 9/11 plot, they'd been trying for over 14 years to get the hidden chapter of the 9/11 report that we knew had to do with Saudi Arabia, and they had a case against Saudi Arabia, but they couldn't get into the courts because of so-called sovereign immunity. So, for instance, sovereign immunity just means, basically, it was a principle of international law until recently. And that principle of international law until recently, it was the fundamental bedrock of international law, really, was that any nation state, and what they mean by that usually is recognized by the community of nations that are recognized nations in the United Nations, the Organization of the United Nations, that any nation state can basically do anything it wants in the world, and they can get by with it because of sovereign immunity, that you cannot sue them, okay? You not only can't sue them and lose, you can't sue them, that you don't have jurisdiction over them. They have a get out of jail free card, basically. And so that was the case with the Motley Rice lawsuit that Jane mentioned, that is ongoing to this day against Saudi Arabia and other plaintiffs as well, many other plaintiffs as well, but Saudi Arabia is the main one. The Saudi Arabian government, which is identical to the Saudi royal family because they're one and the same, because it's a monarchy. It's a formal monarchy, a religious monarchy. So what happened as the 2016 presidential election was approaching, what happened is, seriously, folks, I listened to a radio program of some 9/11 victims' family members with their absolute frustration that they couldn't get through the sovereign immunity of Saudi Arabia. And I went to sleep that night, and I asked the force, if you will, I said, so how do we get through the sovereign immunity? And I woke up in the morning with the answer, and it was a single sentence. It was just a knowing. And I knew that what we needed was a Mike Gravel for the 28 pages. What does that mean? Mike Gravel, former Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska, who I happen to know, he lives in my hometown area in the Monterey Peninsula of California, by nice coincidence. Mike Gravel, who was, of course, senator from Alaska, Mike Gravel was famous for reading good, serious, important sections of the Pentagon Papers on the Senate floor, but in particular in a Senate committee hearing, which is formally part of Senate proceedings of the Congress of the United States. And President Nixon wanted to put him away for life, and there was a lawsuit, and it's called Gravel versus the United States. Well, guess what? Gravel won. And so a fundamental principle was established that, gee, the Constitution really means what it says. There's something called the speech or debate clause in the US Constitution that says in words that no one who is an elected member of Congress can be sued or bothered or even questioned by anyone in the other branches of government, by the executive, the presidency, or even by the courts themselves, for anything that they say in any official proceeding, whether on the floor of the House or the Senate or a hearing room or even in their chambers. They have absolute immunity for any speech. And so what Mike Gravel had done was to, yes, he had gotten the Pentagon Papers illegally. They were still classified at the time, but he started reading them. And once the cat was out of the bag, because of the speech or debate clause in the Constitution, giving him absolute immunity for that act, the Supreme Court of the United States found for Mike Gravel. So, with that context, I woke up in the morning, we need a Mike Gravel for the 28 pages. Who better than the real Mike Gravel, who happens to be up the road? And so I called up Jane. And Jane said, I think we should bring in Mick, who is supposed, hopefully, to be here today, but can't. He's our litigation director for the Lawyers Committee. And Jane and Mick and I got on a conference call. And Mick said, Barb, this is a brilliant idea. We need to do it. It's going to work. I believe it's going to work. But I'm a lawyer. I'm in my protective mode. I want to protect you and Mike Gravel because he's no longer in the Senate and you're not an elected official. So I want to protect you. And the way I'm going to protect you is we're going to work together to do a law review article that pulls together all of the case law that has stemmed and flowed, as they say, from Gravel versus US, which Mike Gravel didn't even know about until Mick Harrison did that legal research and put it together in a draft of a law review article. And then we went back and forth, Jane and Mick and myself, in the Lawyers Committee. At that point, I was a researcher for the group, but not on the board. And we came up with this incredible law review article draft, which then Mike Gravel was given, and Mike Gravel, at my request, personally flew to Washington, D.C. out of his own pocket, and he went to the key members of the House and the Senate who had already read the 28 pages in the classified reading room, elected members of Congress, not allowed by the executive branch, by the CIA basically and the FBI, to even take in a piece of paper and pencil. They could only have what was in their head. But Mike Gravel went to them and gave them the law review article, and they said, oh, well, look at all these cases. There are even cases, Mick found out when he did his legal review, there are even cases that state explicitly, flowing from his own suit that he won at the Supreme Court, US versus Gravel, that say even if it's the highest level of classified documents, if it gets into the hands of an elected member of Congress, House or the Senate, they can do whatever they want with it, and there's absolute immunity for their free speech. But he could do it from memory. So Mike Gravel took this message to these members of Congress, and they in turn took it to Terry Strada, who is the spokesperson for the 9/11 victims' family members. To this day, there is an ongoing case by Terry and over 6,000 9/11 victims' family members in the Motley Rice lawsuit. What happened was, because Mike Gravel took this, and he became the Mike Gravel for the 28 pages, Mike Gravel himself, he took the message to the members of Congress. They in turn went to Terry and her organization. They held press conferences that you can see on YouTube, and it wasn't long before Congress itself, the intelligence committees of the Congress decided, well, we have the power to just say no to the president. We're going to release this. And Congress released the 28 pages. And when the 28 pages were released, they showed the intimate Saudi involvement, especially of Prince Bandar. He's a member of the Saudi royal family, of course, as they all are, because it's a monarchy, and of Prince Bandar being intimately involved with the plot involving 2 of the alleged 19 hijackers. Only 2 who both happened to be on the Pentagon plane, alleged Pentagon plane. So, What happened was the moment the 28 pages came out and it was obvious, suddenly you can read it online with very few redactions. Almost all of it's released, except for sources and protecting sources and methods. Suddenly, Congress got a backbone. And Congress put a bill called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, called JASTA for short. And that is what passed originally unanimously or near unanimously with a few people who didn't vote in the Senate, as I recall. And then the bill went to Obama, and horrendously, Obama took the side of Saudi Arabia, as President Trump does, against over 6,000 9/11 victims' family members who are still suing Saudi Arabia to this day. Once JASTA was passed, they then overrode Obama's veto with a near unanimous vote, almost unanimous in the House and near unanimous in the Senate. JASTA has become law. And what JASTA does, it is an earthquake in the foundation of international law and jurisprudence. What JASTA does, what it says in lay terms, is that no foreign country, unfortunately it doesn't cover the United States government, everybody but. We need a JASTA for the US. But for all nation states except for the United States, what it says is that if there is credible evidence that brought into a court of law, some official judicial proceeding, that is credible, that a foreign government or any of its agents, overt or covert, are credibly involved in a terrorist attack on US soil against at least one US citizen, US citizen, then their sovereign immunity is stripped from them. And so this is today, because of what the Lawyers Committee did, JASTA is now law, and in the United States, no foreign country has sovereign immunity for any terrorist act like 9/11 against US citizens on US soil, including the territories of the United States. And the Lawyers Committee achieved that. But I do want to bring you up to date. I'm holding in my hand an article from this weekend's Wall Street Journal. This is all that there was. I looked in other papers, I couldn't find it. I immediately typed this up because it's a hard copy and sent it to my Lawyers Committee colleagues. So this was Saturday and Sunday's paper just 3 and 4 days ago. Judge delays release of documents in Saudi lawsuit. A judge on last Friday, agreed to give the Trump administration more time to decide whether to shield all documents concerning allegations of official Saudi involvement in the September 11th attacks. A sign that top Justice Department officials are struggling with how to handle demands from those 6,000 or more 9/11 victims' family members who are demanding the information because they've gotten to discovery thanks to JASTA. The 9/11 victims' families are seeking the information as part of a lawsuit against Saudi Arabia, accusing the Saudi government of helping to coordinate the 2001 terrorist attacks. Most of the attackers, according to the official story I add, are from Saudi Arabia. Riyadh, meaning the Saudi government, has denied complicity in the attacks. Invoking the state's secret privilege requires Attorney General William Barr, appointed by Donald Trump, requires his approval. The judge in the case agreed to postpone a last Friday deadline until tomorrow. They didn't want it to happen before the anniversary today. The judge agreed to postpone a last Friday deadline until tomorrow, Thursday, after the Justice Department suggested in a filing in the case that the FBI intends to do everything it can to keep at least some of the information about Saudi involvement from the public. That's where we are. I'd like to ask Jane to maybe bring us up to date on our most recent activities, maybe from the filing of the grand jury petition, Jane, up through the filings that we made in the last few days.
We have several things going on. We have 4 FOIA lawsuits, essentially against NIST, FEMA, to get documents out of their activities during 9/11. Those are still pending. We have the lawsuit against the FBI because we feel that when there's a law that passed that is called the 9/11 Review Commission, the FBI has to review every so often what they have done to see if there's new information on 9/11, and they never do anything. So we've got a lawsuit against them to correct their record and to investigate the new information on bombings, just multiple things that they have overlooked. Then we also have the petition in the Southern District of New York. Now this is, the Southern District of New York is rather famous. That's where all the Epstein stuff was going on recently. And we're hoping that Berman, who's the U.S. attorney there, will start focusing on our issues. We have gotten a letter from the U.S. attorney that they will follow the law. That doesn't really tell us a lot, but again, grand juries are secret. We're really not allowed to know what they're doing, but we're allowed to know a few things. So I don't know if the mandamus has been filed yet. Maybe Barbara knows.
Yes, it has.
But the mandamus is to force, excuse me.
It has, yes.
It has, okay, to force the government to give us whatever information they're allowed to give us, to see if they're actually working with a grand jury on our issues. And that petition that we gave to the U.S. attorney and the amended petition, all the exhibits, it's probably around 160 pages total. You can find on our website. So for right now, we have also maybe 25 other FOIA actions that we want to get involved in. We do want to build a bridge with Motley Rice and the other plaintiffs' law firms to see what discovery they are doing. Motley Rice right now, the judges gave them so much time for depositions, for discovery. That's all going on right now, and that they have X amount of time to do all that, but it's a huge lawsuit, so they have been given X amount of time for depositions and all kinds of discovery. So we're anxious to see what comes out of that. So somehow we'll build a bridge to them if we have not already. I think some of the lawyers have talked to them. But that's what we're doing for now. We have also, and there's two ways to try to get information out of the government. One's at the federal level, one's at the state level. Our President David Meiswinkle has filed an Open Records Act on the photographs with the dancing Israelis, trying to get that information. He's also filed information in Shanksville about any kind of evidence relating to the bodies that were, body parts that were found in Pennsylvania. And what I'm seeing is that what he has gotten information from the state on, now the state's a little bit easier to deal with than the federal, but the state has released records that show little body parts. I mean, so small that it's like a little finger piece. To me, that doesn't sound like a plane crash, and it sounds to me like explosions. Or something blew it up. I don't know. Maybe it's body parts from a morgue that they threw out there. Who knows what it is? But anyway, we're working on that discovery now too, trying to get more information on that at the state level. So we're working both at the federal and the state level.
Jane mentioned on April 10th, we filed a formal petition with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and that was granted, but the grand jury process is secret. So just a few days ago, Mick Harrison and our co-counsel in the New York federal jurisdiction filed what's called a mandamus complaint or lawsuit, and the request for disclosure of administrative documents that when Mick did his legal research, it appears that those are disclosable, whereas some of the more substantive information and documents about what the grand jury is actually doing, unless and until they actually make a public indictment, you're not allowed to know under grand jury secrecy, but you are allowed to have some ministerial records. So we have put in a request for disclosure for those. And we also have a mandamus, which means do your duty, do your mandatory duty. I would like to just say, why did we choose a grand jury? One of the reasons is because in the United States, And this is a tradition that comes from Britain, from common law in Britain. But the federal grand juries are in the United States Constitution. They're explicitly, just like the speech and debate clause that enabled us to overturn hundreds of years of international law and eliminate the sovereign immunity of any foreign country that attacks Americans on American soil. We achieved that. In the US Constitution, there is actually the speech, the federal grand juries are mentioned. And no one can be indicted by a federal prosecutor without getting an indictment or a presentment from a federal grand jury. And that's in the Constitution. Now, amazingly, most people, even our country, don't know, but there is a Supreme Court decision by the then, now deceased, most conservative justice of the Supreme Court at the time, Justice Anton Scalia. He wrote the opinion, which was near unanimous, that actually states in the opinion that the federal grand juries are, quote, the fourth United States citizens, people's branch of the federal government, amazing, co-equal with the US Congress, with the presidency and the executive branch and all of its classification authority, and the whole court system, including the Supreme Court itself. That's an amazing decision. So we have real power if we take it, and that's what the Lawyers Committee has done, to take this power of the Constitution into our own hands. We're taking the truth and the law into our own hands by officializing the truth. And because this is a zero-sum game, the 9/11 Truth Movement has never gone backwards in 18 years as of today. We've never gone backwards, we've always gone forwards. And because we're in a zero-sum game, we're winning, they're losing, and it's only a matter of time before we prevail. Thank you.